In this video, we're going to be looking at the structures of the spinal cord. We can find the spinal cord in the center of this model, surrounded by a cervical vertebrae. We know it's cervical because we have transverse foramen and a bifid or forked spinous process. Let's take a look at our spinal cord. Notice that the white matter, which is made up of myelinated axons, is found around the outside of the spinal cord. The inner layer that kind of forms this butterfly or moth shape is the gray matter. This is where we find cell bodies, glial cells, unmyelinated axons, and dendrites. When we look at the gray matter, we can see that it's divided down into a couple of important structures. At the front of the spinal cord, we find the anterior horn. We know that this is the front because it's close to the body of the vertebrae. Pointing out the back, we have the posterior horn. The posterior horn points the same way as the spinous process. So the anterior horn and the posterior horn. Joining the two sides together, we have the gray commissure. Commissura means joint or joining together or bridge, so the gray commissure joins the two sides together. In the very center of our gray commissure, we have this very small passageway. This is called the central canal. The central canal is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. A couple of other structures that we can see coming out of our spinal cord, we have our roots. Now, the important thing to remember here, don't get root and ramus confused. A root runs from the spinal cord out to the spinal nerve. A ramus is a branch. It's where the spinal nerve splits. Coming out of the front side, we have the anterior roots. The anterior roots carry motor signals. So motor signals that are going to leave the spinal cord to travel out to a muscle or gland of the body come out through these roots. Coming into the back of the spinal cord, we have our posterior roots. Posterior roots carry sensory information. So any sensory information coming into the spinal cord has to travel through our posterior root. Telling the roots apart is very easy when you have the vertebrae. The spinous process is on the posterior side, so that's the posterior root, and the vertebral body right here is on the front, so that's our anterior root. Another way, if you can't see the spinous process or body to tell the roots apart, is if we look, we see this very large swelling on the posterior root. This is called the posterior root ganglion or dorsal root ganglion. This is where we find the cell bodies for sensory neurons. Now notice the posterior root has a ganglion, the anterior root does not. That's because the cell bodies for motor neurons are found here in the anterior horn. Now, as these two roots come together, they form the spinal nerve. Now, our spinal nerve is going to supply motor and sensory input and output to the entire rest of the body. Now, in order to do that, it needs to branch. The Latin word for branch is ramus. So we can see that we have this branch that heads towards the sides and front of the body. This is called the anterior ramus, the front branch. This branch that's going to go around towards the back of the body is the posterior ramus, the back branch. So this carries motor and sensory information to and from the back. The anterior ramus carries motor and sensory information to and from the sides and front of the body, as well as the limbs. And if we take a look, notice how much bigger the anterior ramus is compared to the posterior ramus. That's because the anterior ramus is running more places. We see one other branch. This branch right here is called the Ramus Communicants. Ramus means branch, communicans means communicating. This is our communicating branch. It communicates between the spinal nerve here and the sympathetic chain ganglia. The sympathetic chain ganglia have cell bodies for sympathetic neurons. Now, the reason we call them chain ganglia is because they run down the front of the vertebral column like a chain. So there would be another little ganglion here, another one here, one below, one below. So in order for sympathetics to leave our spinal cord, since they're part of the motor division, they come out the anterior route into the spinal nerve, travel through the Ramus Communicants, and then into our sympathetic chain ganglia. A couple other structures that we can see on this model are the spaces and the meninges. So let's start with the first space that we can see, which is this one here. This is our epidural space. Epi means upon, dural refers to the dura mater. So we can see that this epidural space has lots of blood vessels in it, and it's also filled with adipose tissue. If you've ever heard of an epidural, this is where we put the pain medication during an epidural. Sitting below the epidural space, we have our first of the three meninges, the dura mater. Dura means tough, mater means mother, the tough mother. It's this outer layer that we see here. Now, when we look at this model, see how there's this line? This is showing you the two outermost meninges pancaked together. So on the outside, we have the dura mater, and then pressed up against it, we have our middle meninx, which we call the arachnoid mater. Now, it doesn't look very spider-like, that's what arachnoid means, on this model, but in reality, we would see lots of little delicate spiderweb-like fibers crossing over this space. So dura mater, arachnoid mater. Sitting below the arachnoid mater, we have this space here. This is called the subarachnoid space. Sub means below or under. Arachnoid refers to the arachnoid mater. This space contains cerebrospinal fluid. So if we were down in the lumbar region, say between L3, L4, and L4, L5, we wouldn't find a spinal cord, but we would see a subarachnoid space, and we could insert a needle into that space and take out a sample of CSF. Our last meninx lays directly on the surface of the spinal cord. This is the Pia Mater. Pia means delicate, mater, mother, so this is the delicate mother, in reference to its relatively delicate nature as it sits on top of our spinal cord.